If you thought you already understood Docked, I'll be honest, you probably haven't seen what this game is truly hiding yet. Because behind the most obvious mechanics, Saber Interactive's new title has several details that completely change the way you play once you start noticing what actually matters. If you thought you already understood Docked, I'll be honest, you probably haven't seen what this game is truly hiding yet. Because behind the most obvious mechanics, Saber Interactive's new title has several details that completely change the way you play once you start noticing what actually matters. One tip that makes a huge difference, and that many people might ignore at first, is mastering weight distribution when operating STS cranes. It's not enough to just grab the container and move it quickly from one point to another, because the weight of the cargo completely changes how the crane responds. I like this detail because it makes the game feel more technical and tense, as if every movement truly demands your attention. In practice, what I recommend is adjusting the hoisting speed according to the container's weight. If the load is heavier, it's much more worth it to lift calmly than to try to accelerate and end up creating that dangerous swaying. This kind of oscillation might seem minor at first, but in Docked, it becomes a real problem very quickly, especially when you're trying to keep the operation clean and efficient. The most interesting part is that this level of care provides a great sense of control. When you understand the right rhythm for each load, the movement starts to get much smoother and more precise, and you feel like you're truly mastering the equipment. I think this kind of mechanic is very cool because it transforms a task that could be simple into something more engaging, almost as if the game is teaching you to work better under pressure. This is one of those tips that prevents silly mistakes and improves your overall performance. Avoiding sway isn't just about being meticulous. It's because it can damage the cargo, compromise the ship, and disrupt the entire operation. So, if you want to play Docked in a more efficient and professional way, this is one of the first habits I would try to pick up. Managing maintenance deadlines is the kind of thing that seems secondary at first, but ends up weighing heavily on the operation later. It's not exactly that logic of, I'll fix it just as a precaution, like in some simulators. Because here, wear and tear actually takes its toll, and certain repairs become mandatory. The point is, if you leave it until the last minute, the problem almost always appears at the worst possible time. For me, the smartest way to handle this is to take advantage of low traffic windows to get the equipment in order. Instead of waiting for the machine to break down or get too close to the limit, it's worth watching for when the port is quieter and using that breather to perform repairs without compromising high priority deliveries. It seems like a simple decision, but it makes all the difference when you start dealing with high priority contracts and tighter deadlines. What I like about this mechanic is precisely the silent pressure the game creates. You're not just moving cargo or trying to gain efficiency. You also need to think a few steps ahead so you don't get caught by poorly managed wear and tear. And that's where Docked gets interesting, because it rewards those who play with an operational vision, not just speed. Sometimes, stopping at the right time is much more valuable than insisting on keeping everything running at the limit. This tip is less about fixing equipment and more about avoiding losses before they blow up in your face. Because when a priority contract comes into play, any delay can turn into a fine, and poorly planned maintenance costs much more than a few minutes of downtime. So, if I were to give direct advice, it would be this. Don't treat maintenance as a detail. Treat it as part of the strategy. One thing I consider essential is thinking about logistics chains, even before signing any contract. Many people look first at the mission's gross value, but I think the real profit starts to appear when you realize the time and effort that route will consume. If the path between the storage yard and the rail or road terminals is short, everything flows better, and the day is much more productive. For me, this is one of those cases where playing smart is worth more than simply accepting the contract that looks most lucrative on paper. Short routes reduce travel time, decrease the risk of bottlenecks, and make the operation smoother overall. Instead of spending all your time putting out logistical fires, you maintain a more constant, predictable, and much more efficient flow. What I like most about this tip is that it completely changes how you view the port. You stop thinking only about cargo coming in and out and start seeing the map as a gear system, where every choice influences the rhythm of the rest of the operation. When the yard and land transport are well connected, the game even becomes more enjoyable to manage because everything seems to function at the right time. In the end, I see this optimization as a way to turn organization into actual daily profit. It's not just about working harder. It's about wasting less movement, less time, and less energy on contracts that complicate your routine. So, if I had to give direct advice, it would be this. In Docked, good contracts aren't just the ones that pay well, but the ones that keep your logistics short, clean, and efficient. When I think about efficient growth, one of the first things that comes to mind is exactly where the real bottleneck of the operation lies. And most of the time, it's not in transport, but rather in yard organization. That's why I think it's much smarter to invest first in yard cranes, like RTGs or RMGs, before expanding the truck fleet, as if that alone would speed everything up. To me, this is the type of decision that separates an operation that looks busy from an operation that actually works well. There's no point in having more vehicles circulating if the yard is still slow to organize, sort, and release containers. When this part is stuck, the trucks end up becoming almost a poorly utilized excess because the main flow remains trapped at the same point. What I like about this logic is that it makes you see the port as an entire system, not as isolated pieces. When you improve the capacity of the yard cranes, everything starts moving with more consistency. Containers are positioned more efficiently, space is used better, and cargo exit becomes much more natural. In practice, investing in this structure first usually yields better results than simply putting more trucks on the road. So, if I were to give very direct advice, it would be this. Before thinking about increasing the fleet, look closely at the rhythm of your yard. In Docked, profit and agility don't just come from moving more, but from organizing better. And when you understand that the true bottleneck is there, investing in RTGs or RMGs stops looking like a detail and becomes one of the smartest decisions in your progression. A tip I find essential is using the external camera when you're maneuvering the reach stacker in tighter spaces. I say this because the game clearly wasn't made for you to hit everything by eye just any which way. The margin for error is very small, and this makes the experience much more realistic. So, aligning the vehicle calmly before engaging the container makes much more of a difference than it seems. To me, this is the kind of detail that avoids unnecessary frustration. When you try to do everything too fast, or insist only on a less favorable view, the chance of missing the latch increases significantly. With the external camera, however, you gain a much better sense of positioning, distance, and angle, and this transforms a complicated task into something much more controllable. What I like about this tip is that it doesn't just serve to make things easier, but also to improve your reading of the operation. You start to better understand the space around you, realize how small adjustments completely change the alignment, and begin driving with more precision. In Docked, this carries a lot of weight because the game wants exactly that attention to detail, and the reach stacker isn't very forgiving when you enter crooked or miscalculate the engagement. I see this external camera almost as a mandatory tool in tighter moments. It's not an exaggeration or a shortcut. It's simply using the right resource to work with the precision the game demands. So, if you're having trouble with this part, my tip is straightforward. Before engaging the container, stop for a second, open the external camera, and ensure perfect alignment, because this saves errors, time, and headaches. One of the things I would take most seriously from the start is resource balancing, especially fuel and energy. It's easy to fall into the temptation of spending everything on expansion or new opportunities, but I think the game makes it very clear that operating at the limit is too dangerous. If you don't maintain a reserve fund, it only takes one priority cargo contract appearing at the wrong time for your entire operation to enter a crisis. To me, this type of error is worse precisely because it doesn't seem serious until it happens. While everything is working, it feels like you can push a bit more, save here, postpone there, and keep going. But when fuel or energy runs out in the middle of an urgent job, the problem stops being operational and becomes financial very quickly. Because the failure doesn't just affect that specific service, it can compromise the entire family business. That's why I see upgrades to refueling capacity and energy supply as essential investments, not luxuries. Many people think first of pure productivity, but I honestly believe stability comes first. There's no use growing, accepting heavier contracts, and increasing routine pressure if the foundation of the operation can still collapse due to a lack of resources at a critical moment. This tip is almost a survival mindset within the game. Instead of always playing in the red, hoping everything goes right, the ideal is to build a safety margin to handle the most urgent contracts without panicking. If I were to summarize it directly, I'd say this. In docked, fuel and energy reserves aren't excessive caution. They are what prevent a profitable rush from turning into bankruptcy. When that urgent mission hits after a storm and docked, I find it very easy to make the mistake of wanting to rush straight to the main objective, as if it were just a matter of speed. However, during these times, the port is usually a mess. And what weighs most isn't just what the mission is asking for on the screen, but what is preventing the rest of the operation from getting back to work. That's why I would prioritize removing obstructed containers first, even when they don't seem like the most important task at that moment. For me, this completely changes the rhythm of the mission, because you stop acting only out of urgency and start acting with logic. Clearing space for other machines to circulate and work better ends up accelerating the whole process. What I like about this idea is that it gives off a very good sense of command. Instead of just obeying the objective automatically, you start reading the scenario like someone who is actually trying to recover the port after a disaster. And I think docked works better right there, when it makes you think about the entire flow and not just the next mission marker. This tip is worth a lot because it teaches you to prioritize what unlocks the operation, not just what seems most urgent at first glance. After a hurricane, every second counts. And sometimes the best way to meet a tight deadline isn't to attack the main objective immediately, but to move out of the way what is delaying everything else. To me, this is one of those insights that makes your gameplay much more efficient. A tip I find very valuable in docked is using your first profits to unlock extra storage lots instead of spending everything impulsively. I say this because in the beginning, it's very easy to think only about the current contract and forget that the port needs room to breathe. When you expand this area early on, the feeling is that the entire operation becomes more stable and much less rigid. To me, this investment makes a difference because it gives you the freedom to accept multiple simultaneous contracts without turning the port into chaos. There's no point in trying to grow fast if every new load starts to congest the operational areas and hinders the flow of everything. When you already have more space available, it becomes much easier to organize containers, plan movements better, and avoid that mess that stalls your efficiency. What I like about this tip is that it doesn't seem as flashy as buying new equipment immediately, but in the long run, it yields much more consistency. You start to realize that progression in docked works better when your structure keeps up with your ambition. And then, once storage is more flexible, it makes sense to expand with vehicles as well, because the operation already has the foundation to sustain that growth without suffocating the port. I see this type of choice as a smart way to grow without tripping over your own success. Using initial profits to buy storage lots and then reinforcing the fleet bit by bit makes your routine cleaner, more organized, and much more profitable. If I were to give direct advice, it would be this. In docked, growing isn't just about accepting more contracts. It's about ensuring space and structure so they can happen without turning into a traffic jam. One of the most common traps when we start playing is wanting to unload containers into the first empty space that appears. But the game doesn't forgive this kind of improvisation. And the real trick here is organizing your yard by separating everything by the cargo's final destination: ship, train, or truck. It might seem like overkill at first, but I guarantee that creating this habit of categorizing stacks is what separates a port that works from one that stays jammed. I say this because the punishment for scattering things without criteria hits hard during peak hours. Imagine placing a mountain of containers that will leave by rail at the opposite end of the rail terminal. When you need to dispatch them quickly on a high priority contract, your machines will have to cross the entire map, creating absurd traffic. This unnecessary back and forth generates a bottleneck effect that completely destroys your logistical efficiency and delays all other deliveries. To solve this and maintain peace in your gameplay, the focus must always be on creating short flows. The golden rule is to prioritize storage in zones that are adjacent to the correct exit terminals. Road cargo stays near the truck exit, and what goes to the railway waits right next to the tracks. When you start playing with this mindset, the difference on the screen is massive because the machines barely need to travel and everything flows at an almost hypnotic pace. Managing stacking isn't just about making the port look pretty. It's the key to ensuring your delivery volume doesn't drop when the pressure increases. In docked, poor organization generates real congestion that will swallow your profit and ruin the best contracts. So, before dropping any container on the ground, think about where it will be leaving from later. This few-second planning completely changes the speed of your operation. One thing that caught me by surprise when I started operating the STS cranes was how seriously the game takes cargo physics. When you're moving heavy containers, especially those more loaded, you can't simply go from one point to another and stop dead as if it were a common vehicle. The game simulates inertia quite realistically, and that means the load literally becomes a giant pendulum hanging from the cable. What happens in practice is that if you brake abruptly when you're already over the drop point, the container doesn't stop with the crane. It keeps swinging back and forth, and you're just standing there, watching those precious seconds slip through your fingers while waiting for the damn cargo to stabilize enough to make the connection. It's frustrating because it feels like you did everything right during the movement, but at the crucial moment, the timing escapes your control. The way I found to get around this was to start decelerating the crane trolley well before reaching the final destination. Instead of going at maximum speed until the last second, I gradually decreased the pace in advance, almost as if I were making a smooth approach. This way, when the crane actually stops, the container is already practically stationary with it, no swaying, ready to descend cleanly into the right spot. This completely changes the fluidity of the operation because it saves those seconds of waiting, which, added up over several movements, turn into minutes of difference by the end of the day. In docked, where every contract has that clock ticking behind you, not having to wait for the load to stop swinging is a huge advantage. So, if you're having difficulty with discharge times on the STS, try this smoother approach, anticipating the braking, because mastering this inertia is what separates an amateur operation from a professional one.